what would constitute, well, let me start out with what do I expect to happen in this round, and then I'll discuss what would constitute success for each of the parties. First, what do I expect to happen this round is that the Iranian focus will be on showing that they could be tougher than was the Rouhani team, and that Raisi is not like Rouhani. He can't be pushed around, and that he will insist on a much tougher stance. That's their principal objective. For the United States and the Europeans, their principal objective is to demonstrate that they are being reasonable and patient, and that they're not in a hurry, and they can take their time, and that they are going to emphasize that, well, we got close to a deal last time, now let's just complete this. Then for the Russians and the Chinese, their major objective will be to show that the West is impotent and can be ignored. So that's the objective of each of the sides, and frankly, they're each likely to achieve their objective. So we're not likely to see much progress at this talk, towards an agreement, but we're likely to see progress towards the objectives of each of the three sides. So for the Biden team, in many ways, for Biden's political advisors, their principal concern about these talks is that they want these talks to be off the front pages of the newspapers and to be something that they can be ignored. Biden has a lot in his agenda. His principal objective for this next month and next months is getting past his economic program, his new infrastructure bill, very narrow majority in Congress. It's going to be a lot of difficulties getting that thing through. And that's the focus. And I think you can appreciate this. In Israel, there was a lot of focus on getting the budget through, and that's all that mattered. And so for the Biden team, that's all that matters. And they don't want foreign affairs to get in the way. And they certainly don't want the Middle East to get in the way, because they regard the Middle East as an area that's taken way too much time and effort on the part of previous administrations, and so they'd like to ignore this issue as much as they can. And indeed, in general, their approach towards the Iran nuclear question is they'd like to postpone it indefinitely, and they hope that Iran doesn't do anything dramatic, and that the world is able to ignore what progress Iran makes. Meanwhile, for Iran, in many ways, what constitutes success is to be able to continue with their advances in their nuclear program without the world paying much attention. So they've done an awful lot of things, especially in the last few months, that would previously have been considered crossing red lines so dramatically that there would be a huge crisis. And as far as Iran's concerned, they're having a lot of success in getting the world used to Iran making progress that would previously have been unacceptable, but now gets ignored. So I suspect that this situation will continue for quite some time, because the Biden administration has no plan B. And therefore, they will continue with plan A and claim that plan A is working, just be patient. So what the Biden team has done is managed to carefully exclude any of the possibilities that might constitute a plan B. And let me run through those and explain the Biden administration attitude towards each of them. One would be to increase sanctions, step up the pressure. Well, the Biden team is convinced that Trump's policy of maximum pressure was a failure, and that to return to that policy would be to suggest that Biden is no different than Trump, and that's not acceptable to them. So they're not prepared to do it. And besides which, they make the point, which happens to be true, that neither China nor Russia will particularly cooperate with any attempt to impose additional sanctions on Iran. They're not cooperating very much with existing sanctions on Iran, and they only do that to the extent to which Chinese and Russian firms fear U.S. reactions. Not because Beijing or Moscow tells their firms to pay attention to these measures, but because Chinese and Russian firms are concerned about retaliation by the United States government. So maximum pressure is out. Then what about the United States making gestures towards Iran, what usually are called confidence building measures in these kinds of negotiations? And there, the Biden administration has persuaded itself that this is useless. They think that they made an important gesture when the United States renounced the snapback that the Biden administration had said had occurred to the UN sanctions, and that Biden walking that back they thought was an important gesture on their part, and they got exactly nothing for it. Neither the Europeans, nor the Russians, nor the Chinese, nor the Iranians paid any attention whatsoever. So the Biden team is convinced that unilateral confidence-building measures will produce nothing, that they will be ignored, the Iranians will pocket them, and there will be no progress. Meanwhile, we see absolutely no interest on the Iranian side in having reciprocal confidence-building measures. So confidence-building measures, or some kind of an interim agreement, what my colleague Dennis Ross likes to refer to as a lesser for lesser agreement, it's not the Biden administration's strategy. They just don't think it's going to work. What about covert actions against the Iranian nuclear program? Well, the Biden team has started to go semi-public with what it's been saying in private for some time, which is that the U.S. intelligence community has concluded that Israeli covert actions against the Iranian nuclear program were counterproductive, and that what Iran has done is build back better. And so that the Israeli actions, in fact, helped Iran strengthen its program, strengthen the defense of its program, and to rebuild even better than what it had before. So it's an interesting critique that we are hearing from the Biden team about covert actions. This is very different than what we heard during the Obama administration. During the Obama administration, there was a very strong sense that Israeli covert actions were complicating the negotiations, making it more difficult to reach an agreement, and that therefore Israel should stop. And that furthermore, Israeli attacks against Iranian nuclear scientists were immoral, and Israel shouldn't do this. That's not what the Biden team is saying. What the Biden team is saying is that the Israeli actions are counterproductive for slowing the nuclear program. And that's why these shouldn't be pursued, is because while they may make Israel feel better, that they don't actually slow Iran's nuclear program. So that is an argument for why the United States should not engage in these covert actions either. So maximum pressure is out. Confidence building measures is out. Covert actions is out. Well, it doesn't leave you a whole lot else. Now, in theory, you could have a decision that, well, all right, we're going to have to accept that Iran is going to be a de facto nuclear power, and that we'll have to learn how to live with it and figure out how to deter Iran. Yes, that you could, in theory, accept that. But the problem is that President Biden won't. And President Biden has made it very clear to his advisors that that is utterly unacceptable to him. So he is not prepared to accept that Iran becomes a de facto nuclear power, but he's also not prepared to do anything about it except for have diplomatic negotiations. Well, that leaves the poor diplomats in a very difficult situation because they don't have a very strong hand. I mean, if you don't have anything backing you up, if the only plan is your plan A of diplomacy, well, what can you do? Now, I should mention one interesting aspect about this is that the United States elite, the military and the intelligence community, have concluded that the United States does have military means to destroy Iran's nuclear program. So they are firmly convinced that the United States has a military option were the United States to want to exercise it. But they don't think that it should be exercised, but they think that the U.S. does have that option. And that's, by the way, is also different to the Obama administration, which was highly skeptical about the idea that there could be any military option other than a full-scale war with Iran. That's not true of this team. So that's sort of where we stand. Now, let me say something about the Israeli actions and the U.S. government attitude towards Israeli actions. As I said, the Biden team has gone semi-public with its criticisms of Israeli covert actions, but Biden himself doesn't say that, and in fact, his officials on the record don't say that. That echoes Biden's general approach towards Israel, which is that he does not make open public criticism. This is, again, very different from the Obama administration. The Biden team also, particularly President Biden himself, accepts that Israel has to have the freedom of action to decide what it needs to do on its own. And so if the Israel were to launch a major military action against Iran, the Biden team would be unhappy, but not necessarily going to go that loud with his criticisms. I have, in various times in my life, made myself unpopular by pointing out that throughout U.S. history, the U.S. approach towards wars, with the exception of the 2002 disastrous invasion of Iraq, the U.S. approach towards wars has been to wait until they can blame somebody else for starting a war. And that's what we did, not just famously in World War II, but it's what we did in Vietnam with the Gulf of Tonkin episode. It's what we did in World War I, the sinking of the Lusitania. It's what we did with the Spanish-American War. Remember the Maine. It's what we did in the Civil War, where President Lincoln did not call out the Federal Army until the Confederate forces had attacked Fort Sumter in South Carolina. And so it would fit with the U.S. history if the United States waited until there was an Israeli attack on Iran for the start of major conflict, and then the United States got involved, presumably because of Iranian retaliation, excuse me. I'm not predicting that, but I'm just commenting that's what would fit with U.S. history. So let me leave it at that.
Thank you very much, Dr. Clawson. We're going to take it to Dr. Nissim Levy, and then we're going to open for questions. Dr. Nissim Levy, when you're ready, please begin.
Okay.
Unmute yourself.
I thought I did. Thank you very much. Can you hear me well?
Yes.
Okay. So thank you, Tal, and also I appreciate the Central Media for taking.
You're muted again.
Oh, wow. I hope I don't have a problem.
Let's try again. All good.
Okay. I'm saying thank you very much, Tal, and I appreciate this Central Media doing this event. It's not the first one. I think it's really important in order to do it, once the conversation in Vienna must start. And also, Patrick, I thank you for this coverage of the topic. But I will, some comments about what you said and some different angle, which is quite logically. Let me start with an opening statement that I'm not representing any official opinion, because I do take a specific role, not in the Iranian topic, but a different topic of the security. So my point of view here is only of the World Nuclear Forum, which is a forum of 200 scientists and senior people, but I'm not a formal of the government, of course. I want to divide my 10 or 15 minutes to 4 parts. First of all, I want to talk about basic principles and a little 1-2 sentence remind of the JCPOA. Then to talk about what we know about uncertainties. Then take it to what should be or known to be as known facts. And then to the most important part, which is a forecast. So first of all, a few reminders about the basic principle. The JCPOA, which was done in 2015, included 7 topics, which was the centrifuge, their size or the generation and sites. Uranium enrichment was started to be at the beginning of 3.67, then jumped to 20, 60, and even 90 that were talked about. And we should recall that the uranium enrichment is much more difficult to go up to 20, and above 20 is quite simple, simplifying as it can, to enrich to the larger amount. Then the third topic is the break-in time, which means how long they can run into a nuclear bomb or a nuclear weapon And it's really sometimes really makes me funny to hear some expert talking about 1 month, 2 months, once year. And I really don't understand this sentence, because what people expect to think if they say like they have 1 month to break in time. There's nothing in the nuclear field that you can do it in 1 week or 1 month. So the fourth topic is the Fordow site, and then 5 is the research and development. The 6 is the supervision. It was discussed that about 150 inspectors can go into Iran and inspect things. Then the sanctions, and the last one is the removal of the sanctions, which means they said a panel of all the countries that 5 of them can discuss and decide if Iran will say if Iran did not need what to be in the agreement. This is about the reminder. Now, the second thing I want to talk about in this specific opening, that a complete weapon is not only enrichment of uranium, and some experts say in our forum that they're talking a lot about the uranium in order to do a smoke, kind of to take the main point of the discussion to non-relative or non-important discussion. So if we talk about a nuclear weapon or a state that have nuclear weapon, we talk about 3 items. We talk materials and components. We talk nuclear warheads. This is just basically taking all together. And then the not most important, but very important, is mean of launch. So the point is that discussing mainly on the uranium is really not the main point. Now I want to go to part B of this discussion and talk about uncertainty. So if we think about what's going on in the world, and a lot of information is going on, we know that the uranium is being reached above 3.67, but we don't know exactly how much. Many numbers have been thrown to the air, but we don't know. This is the first thing we don't know. Second thing, we don't know what is the level of preparedness of Iran, of all the facilities, the launch, system reliability, human resources, manpower, and so on. Third thing that the world doesn't know, that this is a good question, very simple one, but very good questions. How come a country like Iran, which is supposed to have brilliant mathematicians and physicians, and they don't have a nuclear bomb after 70 years? And if we compare it, and I will elaborate a little bit more, with North Korea, we can all agree, or I think we can all agree, that Iran is a different country than North Korea, and North Korea did it and find it in a very kind of short time of and get the nuclear weapon. So how come Iran, after 70 years, did not get that? And the fourth point of uncertainty, that I heard some experts in the last few months saying that the UN, United Nations, is sacrificing the IAEA, and Rafael Grossi as well, to be like the guarding guy of the agreement, which they cannot really do much. They do, and we know they did more than once report, serious reports about what Iran did not did with the agreement argument. So that's just for what uncertainties. Now we're going to go to item number 3, which is it's called to be a known fact. First of all, I'm not saying it for 100%, but we think all over the world, we think, it's not for sure, that Iran does not have still a full nuclear weapon. Second of all, we know that for fact, North Korea does have a nuclear weapon. Another fact that we know that Syria does not have, Syria right here, does not have a nuclear weapon. Why? Because it was, taken by bomb on 2007. We also know that Iraq was taken by force on 1981, and they don't have a nuclear weapon, only by force. So another thing we know is the agreement of the 2015 did not hold Iran from getting more having nuclear weapon. And we know that Iran is a problem of many more countries, not only Israel, like Saudi Arabia, Arab Emirates, and Gulf states. And we know another thing, that the country that have nuclear weapon get low profile. We can see all countries, even North Korea, once they have their weapon, they became with low profile. So those about what should be a known fact. Now let's talk about what forecast. we in the forum think that the two vectors of the United States and Israel are going to take two directions now, two known directions. One of them is the United States keep on going on the diplomatic, as Patrick said, the diplomatic side, and Israel probably it's the point that should take the vector of the operational one. We also know that Israel is getting really close, that's what we think, to a decision point, which in the past we had enough reasons to believe that we can still push and wait and push and wait. So we know that that's the point right now. We do understand, and we focus, and what we think as a forecast is once there will be an agreement, and it will probably lower the opportunities of countries like Israel and other countries to work. So if there's no agreement, basically each country, I'm saying it is very careful, can do what it wants. But once there is an agreement, it limits only Iran. It limits not only Iran, but also countries like Israel or other countries that have a problem with Iran from working. So what we believe in the forum, and I will probably start to conclude my thing here, that we think there will not be an agreement, because agreement is basically a license to keep on getting nuclear for Iran. This is what the last agreement did. And any agreement between two states, two parties, and two countries is like some kind of momentum. So we think in the forum that the momentum is out of balance, which means it's become to be like a bubble gum. Yes, no, maybe, powerful agreement, small agreement, large agreement. It became to a point which is not like a decisional yes or no. So we don't think there's going to be an agreement. And we will probably keep seeing of some sabotage in the Iranian nuclear program. So that's what I wanted to say so far.
Thank you both very much. Dr. Clawson, would you have anything to comment on that before we open for questions? No, okay. Journalists, if you have a question, I see nobody raise your hand, but if you do have a question, please unmute yourselves and go ahead. Christine, I see your hand. We'll start with you.
Hi, this is Christine from the German newspaper Die Welt. So my question is, would Israel be ready to openly attack Iran? And I don't mean from a political standpoint. Does it have the technique, the measures, and the weapon that can break into the bunkers? Like, would Israel be ready to pursue an attack alone, or do they need the help from the US?
Doctors, before you answer, please make sure to unmute yourselves. Patrick, Dr. Clawson, we'll start with you.
So during the Obama administration, the U.S. government was loud and clear about saying that they felt that Israel did not have the means to attack Iran. This was said at every level, whether it was the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, the Secretary of Defense, the various heads of intelligence community agencies. We have not heard that from the Biden administration. The Biden administration has been very careful not to say that. And that fits with the Biden administration's approach of not openly criticizing Israel. But it also fits with a different evaluation of Israeli capabilities. So it's quite obvious, seen from Washington, that Israel is concentrating on developing better capabilities to attack Iran. But the political point I would make here is that the United States government is not saying that Israel lacks the capabilities of attacking Iran's nuclear program effectively.
Dr. Nissim Levy, would you have anything to add?
Yes, thank you, Christina, for this question. Obviously, I cannot know what the Israeli government would do, but as our assessment says, is first of all, the United States and Israel are long way, very good allies. So usually the Israeli states would work together with the American state, with the Biden administration. But I think it's reached to a point which something may happen with collaboration, of course, but under or over the table, we don't know that yet. And I remind you that Israel is a surviving state. So when there is a point which see there's no, because any country all over the world, and we know it for facts as well, any countries that have a nuclear program ready to go, then the language become different. So there's less thing you can constrain and do with them. So to conclude, my answer is we work, the Israeli government work hand in hand with the American administration, but there is a point, I think that this point is come closer to need to do something, and it's not a diplomatic way.
Thank you very much. Do we have any more questions? Any more questions from the audience, from our journalists?
If I may make a comment,
Please.
in my personal life, I am always reluctant to make unpleasant decisions and to take difficult steps. And I have a great deal of respect for the ability of politicians to do the same. So I'm not surprised that when politicians try to postpone things. And so while I would agree with Dr. Levy that it appears that Israel is getting close to the decision point, the ability to postpone difficult decisions is an impressive human characteristic. And so I would not be surprised if the difficult decisions were postponed much longer than we might expect.
Christina, I see you have another one.
Yeah, sorry, I just used the time until somebody else raises his hands. One more question. What's your perspective on Trump's strategy of maximum pressure? I mean, Netanyahu, for example, always said that this is the right way to go, that the JCPOA was not hindering Iran in any way. And now it seems, at least in Israel, that the perspective has changed a little bit. Nobody's saying it like this anymore. And it also seems like Trump's strategy has failed. I mean, it doesn't, all the sanctions didn't keep Iran from enriching uranium and also developing no centrifuges and so on and so on. What's your stance on this? Was this a successful policy, or was it right to follow this strategy or not?
Well, that strategy of pressure seemed to work under Obama. I mean, that's, after all, an important reason why the Iranians returned to the nuclear negotiating table after walking away and telling the Europeans to get lost. And so it would appear that maximum pressure was quite successful under the Obama administration. So it was not surprising that the Trump administration decided that it was going to go that route. The difficulty is that in the interim, Iran's supreme leader Khamenei and the Revolutionary Guards that are so important as his support base had decided that they could live with the poverty which comes from the maximum pressure. Khamenei is not Xi Jinping, and he does not think that economic growth is essential in order to sustain him in power. And he's decided that he can live with the maximum pressure campaign. And someone like Raisi is even more convinced of that, because Raisi thinks that it's unlikely that the United States in particular, or the West in general, will ever ease up on their sanctions. And so that he does not think that no matter what promises were made by the United States, that there would be any substantial reduction in pressures. That's his reading of what happened of the JCPOA. And it is certainly true that the United States has no intention of easing a lot of its unilateral sanctions on Iran. And the Raisi team is also quite correct that an awful lot of European firms are not going to be prepared to invest in Iran, and may even be reluctant to trade with Iran so long as there are such strict U.S. financial sanctions on any transactions involving the U.S. dollar with Iran. So the Raisi team doesn't think that there's any point in trying to get the sanctions lifted, and that what Iran should do instead is find ways to get around the sanctions as best it can. And the only sanctions that they care about particularly are the restrictions on the Iranian oil exports. And they think that they've developed ways to export their oil. Now, it is true that there's an awful lot of Iranian assets around the world to which Iran has limited access, these so-called frozen assets, which the IMF estimates is over $100 billion. It is true that the United States would be prepared to see Iran make much more use of those assets, not completely free use of those assets. But for instance, Iran imports billions and billions of dollars worth of wheat and rice and barley and corn every year. And the United States would be prepared to see Iran use those assets for those purposes. So it would be possible to reach a deal which gave Iran quite a financial benefit. But at least so far, we see very limited interest in the Iranian government in reaching a deal like that. They seem to be much more interested in finding ways to evade U.S. restrictions and to find ways to gain assets to those funds without having to have the United States formally lift its maximum pressure campaign. Now, one element of maximum pressure, which the United States often emphasizes, is that this makes it difficult for Iran to get foreign investment. And so, for instance, we've seen in the recent months the government of the UAE talking to Iran about possibly making substantial investments in Iran in return for a new nuclear deal. Well, the fact is that Khamenei doesn't want foreign investment, and the Revolutionary Guards don't want foreign investment. They think that that's a trap, and that it's giving things to foreigners, giving up unilateral concessions to foreigners. So they don't want the foreign investment. So that's not a particularly attractive offer as far as they're concerned.
Dr. Nissim, Levy, would you have anything to add before we move on to another question?
Yeah, a few sentences. First of all, I think the sanctions were very useful, and the Iranians were really smart to show like this is not going to change, because how you change course between states? Only by pressuring the regime. And if you make a sanctions, the problem is going on the population, but the regime became less stable, and this is one of the more powerful leverage you can put on regime. So we think the sanctions were really useful. And yes, that's the way to go. That's it.
Thank you, Chris.
Yeah, Chris Mitchell with CBN News. You've alluded to it. What impact, if any, do you believe the civil unrest and protests throughout the country in the last few years is having on the regime and its willingness and ability to develop a nuclear weapon?
In short, not much. The regime was once upon a time very worried about demonstrations, for instance, after the 2009 contested presidential elections. But in the last decade or so, has completely reorganized its apparatus, the police and the paramilitary besiege force, in order to deal with such protests, and has persuaded itself that it has to be prepared to use deadly force to put down protests. So what we saw with the gasoline protests of a few years ago is that the regime was quickly resorted to deadly force and felt proud that it did so and had no problems doing this. Again, very different than what happened in 2009, where the regime was extremely reluctant to use that kind of force. So it's a very different approach. And meanwhile, the Khamenei is, for the last 25 years, 30 years, persuaded himself that the United States is out to overthrow his regime, and that what we want to do is have a velvet revolution, a soft overthrow of his regime, by using U.S. culture to undermine the revolutionary values of the regime and bring about the end of the regime. And in many ways, Khamenei is quite correct that Western culture is terribly attractive to Iranians. And what has occurred in Iran over the last 30 years has been a cultural revolution, and that Khamenei is lost. So Iran's a very different place than what it was 30 years ago, and Western culture has greatly penetrated it. But Khamenei and the Revolutionary Guards have reorganize themselves to deal with this situation and are quite prepared to put down protests by the population and don't feel particularly threatened by those protests, and do feel that those protests are inevitably going to happen, and that they are spurred by the kind of desire for Western values and Western civilization, which they reject.
Dr. Nissim Levy, anything to add?
Yes, the protests are really help, but not to the point in discussion, because it is, I slightly disagree with Patrick, and I think those protests are really important for the general purpose, but will not be enough, definitely not be enough in order to prevent Iran from going nuclear. So it's a good thing, it's good leverage, but it's not going to help with the issue which discussed in here, which is the nuclear program for Iran. That's it.
Do we have any more questions? All right, so I'll ask the last one, and this is for Dr. Clawson. Netanyahu, well, the former government's approach was very much, we're opposed to the agreement. We're not going to take any part in any discussion, in any talks whatsoever. We're going to take our own route, and you do, and you make the discussions. If you were in Israel's shoes, what would you suggest Bennett or the current government to do? Join the diplomatic effort?
Well, I don't give other governments advice. I only give advice to my own government. But I would just comment that the one way to guarantee that you're going to lose a fight with your spouse is to win a fight with your spouse. And that also applies in politics. So the one way to guarantee that you're going to lose a fight with the President of the United States is to win a fight with the President of the United States. So I always thought that Netanyahu's approach was, if he succeeded, he would have a big problem. And when I take a look at what both Bennett and Biden are doing, the two of them seem determined not to have public fights. So I'm not surprised at that. And I think that that attitude will persist, that neither side will want to pick a public fight with the other side. And it's really not usually a way to win international politics.
I'll take that for a no. We're gonna end this here. Thank you both for taking the time to speak to us today. This was very interesting. Journalists, I hope you found this useful. Have a great rest of the day. Thank you very much. Stay safe, everybody. Goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you.